we we do have Catholics that work predominantly for certain denominations of Christianity, along with other faiths. But all the chaplains are trained to be able to service all the denominations of their faith and to supposedly help soldiers of other faiths also.
Welcome to the Generation Zion podcast with Todd and David. Together, they discuss the war against God in the world today.
Welcome to the Generation Zion podcast. I'm David.
I'm Todd.
And today we are not in the same building today. We're actually on a Zoom call. So we're trying this out for a change. And we have a guest with us today. If you'd like to introduce yourself however you'd like.
Retired U.S. Army service member Wayne. Yeah, I'm retired Army veteran. I spent 15 years in the Army. I currently work for a major firearms manufacturer.
So if you wanna lead, Todd, this one's gonna be all you. I'm running on, like I said earlier today, I'm running on thoughts and prayers right now. I've been awake for 28 hours now.
Yeah, that's brutal.
All right.
So, Wayne, we're so glad to have you first off. And so last time I talked with David about his experiences growing up around the military, his experiences in the military, his experiences really seeing between, I guess, what you would call civilian life and military life. And so wanted to get an idea from another perspective, and who better than David's own father. So, Wayne, I wanted to start by sort of getting an idea of where you grew up, and really, was anybody in your family military as you were growing up?
As I was growing up, I had some cousins in the military, one specifically that I looked up to a lot. Most of my uncles and aunts had served during the Vietnam era. My dad hadn't because he had medical conditions that precluded him from being able to serve. I grew up just a couple houses down from the government projects in a lower middle class to middle class family. Yes.
Yeah,
Went to church every Sunday. Went to public schools. Knew I wanted to join the army since I was in elementary school.
Interesting. What do you think? You mentioned your cousin before. Do you think it was your cousin that you looked up to so much? Was there an age gap enough that would start that early, or?
Yeah. Well, not that early. I was brought up believing in God and country and having a strong love for God and country, and I mean that was pretty much drilled into my head, my whole life. And I still believe it. Even as screwed up as it sounds, if they called me and said, "Hey, we need you," I'd be back in a heartbeat.
So, as you're growing up, one thing I'm curious about is so I know that you're a little bit younger than I am. So what I'm assuming is that you grew up in either the late 80s or the 90s. Is that what
I
you're
was born in 81.
Okay. So as you were growing up, one thing I'm really curious about is what was, when you were going to public schools, how welcome was the military in those schools at that point?
actually quite. When I was a kid, I remember on certain. hmm, I remember the National Guard coming to even my elementary school when I was a kid a couple of times to show off their stuff. When I was in high school, they were there every year, the reserves, the National Guard, every career fair, they had people there for the military. We didn't have an ROTC at the school that I went to. They do now,
Hmm.
but ROTC wasn't as far spread up here in the north as it, back then as it is now.
Hmm.
I
But it was.
mean,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, it was the Gulf War era, so everybody was pro-military back then.
Yep. Yeah, I remember. You know, the all the yellow ribbons, and the yeah. Well, the first Gulf War anyway.
Yeah.
That that was there. That would have been my time. I've never been military. My grandfather was in World War II, but I've never been military. My father would have been Vietnam era, except that he had some kind of educational deferment at the time. But but I just so you know where I come from is that not being a military guy, I wasn't. I was always very welcoming to the military. I was never the kind of guy I felt like I could go into the military because I would have a hard time taking orders. But especially during that first Gulf War, I had a lot of friends who would. They kept threatening to go to Canada if the draft came out again. I was not one of them. I would have gone. I would have been if they would have drafted me. I would have gone gladly myself. I just never was. So, but it was where I grew up. I grew up in the Baltimore area, so it's a little bit different, a little further south. It's actually in the south. Most people don't know, but it's in the south, and so there was a lot of military presence, especially in Baltimore, because you go by DC. But
Oh yeah.
so what? When did you join up? I know that you were eager to join up from a young kid, and so did you join up right at 18?
I joined up when I was 17 years old,
Oh,
when I was in a junior in high school, on what they called the delayed entry program. I mean, I had a lot of different people trying to push me in different directions to when they found out I was joining the military. My mom, she was a Navy corpsman, so of course she wanted me to go Navy.
hmm.
Uh, Honestly, originally I was thinking about the Marines, but my Uncle Fred convinced me not to join the Marines. He was a Marine during Vietnam. He saw a lot of messed up stuff.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
he still lives with those scars today. So,
I can only
but
imagine.
my dad wanted me to join the Air Force because, well, he wanted me to have a safe, cushy job, and well, me being me, I did exactly what my dad didn't want me to do and join the Army like my cousin Aaron.
That's what I was going to ask. I was trying to remember if you had mentioned that. So it was the army that your cousin was at. So that was
Yeah.
that.
He was in military intelligence.
Oh, so you joined the army at 17. Uh, did you when? How long from when you officially joined up to when you went into basic training? Did you finish high school and then went into basic
I
training? How it worked?
finished high school. I spent the summer hanging out with my friends, and then I chipped off the basic August 11th, 1999.
Wow, wow.
It
So it
was
was,
it was a different world back then.
yeah. And I mean, we certainly could ask you about basic training. I don't know if there are any particular stories you saw about basic training, but I'm sure that was in a sense, a rude awakening. You were, excuse me, prepared for it, right? Both by all the military people around you. But
Hon- Honestly, I didn't find basic training all that hard. It was stressful, but I was in really good physical condition, and I was already prepared by my relatives for what was coming.
Mm.
I mean, that and marksmanship was no problem. Been shooting since I was 3 years old. Uh, Physical fitness, hand to hand, all that stuff was no problem. The land nav and stuff like that, easy. I was an Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts, and all my Scout masters were Korean War era veterans of the Marine Corps,
Mm.
which is one of the reasons why I was thinking about joining the Marines. But no, basic. When I went through basic, it was during an experimental phase in the Army. They were doing experiments with stress level. So my unit was in one of the higher stress levels.
Interesting.
And I honestly didn't have that much of an issue with it because I was already mentally prepared for it. But the good thing about the higher stress levels, it weeded out the people that had lower moral values, lower intestinal fortitude, lower um, tolerance for that type of stuff.
Hmm.
And out of everybody that I went to basic training with, as far as I know, we're all still, well, except for those that cash the ultimate check for their country, are all still up and kicking.
Hmm.
I have run into some people that were in the lower stress level training and they didn't fare as well.
Really, really interesting. Now, and you mean by fair as well as in after the service, or
The
even
people
during?
with low, yeah, the people in the lower stress level classes that I've met tend to have more issues with their PTSD. I mean, we all have it, but some people have a harder time dealing with than others. And they also seem to, from what I understand, have a higher suicide rate.
Wow, wow. Do you think that it's because the higher stress level hardens people faster? Hotter fire hardens faster.
Yeah. I mean, basic training, what it's designed to do, what it's meant to do, is break you down to your core element and rebuild you into a soldier.
Yeah.
So sorry, allergies. The faster they break you down, the faster they can get to the rebuilding and the more they can do with you.
Interesting. So that brings up an interesting point because do you feel that those who and it sounds like you thrived under that. I mean, that's what you basically said. You thrived under that higher pressure. Do you feel that it's because you brought a much, let's call it larger core to it so that you didn't have as much to break down or maybe even that much to rebuild? Or do you
I mean,
feel truly they broke you down?
I feel that I didn't break down the way a lot of people did because I mean, I grew up in a military family. I mean, my mom was harder on me than the drill sergeants were, so but it was good for me. Uh, I mean, my family, as soon as they knew that I was thinking about joining the military, they took it upon themselves to help me prepare for it. And I was prepared more for what they went through than what I went through, which was by far worse.
Really?
I mean, I do feel that going through basic training, going through what I went through, made me more of a man and made me a better person and definitely a better soldier.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's something I did want to like touch on is the huge like difference between basic training then and now. That's something I really wanted to like talk about because we're definitely seeing a lower quality soldier these days compared to what it was back then. Even when I was going through training, the drill sergeants were that I trained under were really pointing that out, especially to us. Even if it was part of like the breaking down thing, a lot of the time it seems like they were being genuine. Like when they had that, sometimes they'd sit down, talk to you like soldier to soldier instead of like trying to talk down to you to build you back up. When they were having those serious talks with you, sometimes they do that. Like we're seriously like the army is more focused on, like one drill sergeant said, that one of my favorites, I forget his name now, but he said that the army is more focused on sharp and EO, and if you don't know what that is, it's the sexual harassment and rape prevention uh, and was it equal opportunity, which is basically just disguised affirmative action.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I went through basic training, when you were they break it down into phases. I did an OSIT training, so my basic and AIT was all rolled together in one unit. We never left that unit. So they break it down into different phases. I understand they have fewer phases now, but red phase was the beginning phase. And if you messed up, they could bump you back to a lower phase with fewer privileges or all the way back to the beginning. My unit got bumped back to red phase several times. And when you're in red phase, they're in your face, they're calling you names, they're pushing you around, they're bullying you, they're doing what they need to do to make you a soldier. Once you're into the higher level phases, like white phase, black phase, gold phase, they tend to talk to you more personally, treat you more like a soldier because you've earned it. I mean, one of my favorite moments of AIT was we came back from the field and we were sitting there cleaning our gear. It was the last field problem of training. And we're sitting there cleaning the gear and getting everything ready. And Drill Sergeant Levante, my favorite drill sergeant that I had, actually pulled us all together and just started telling us war stories and started telling us about his experience in the Army. And that meant a lot to most of us. It was a real one-on-one personal time.
I can imagine that. I assume that I would infer that you wouldn't really get much, if anything, personal from him aside from that, because especially if you were back in those earlier phases, like the red phase, he would he would be too busy screaming in your face rather than telling you.
He was one of the hardest ball busting drill sergeants. Hell, one of the hardest ball busting NCOs because I've met him for long in my career that I ever knew. But he was also honestly, one of the better people I've ever known.
Hey guys, I just want to.
Because he was doing it. He wasn't doing it out of spite. He wasn't doing it out of meanness. He was doing it to prepare us for what he knew we would eventually face.
I just want to put it out there really quick that there's like 4 phases. There's not less. There's actually more now. There's like yellow phase when you get in. It's basically your processing. Then there's red and blue and white.
I don't count that one.
Yeah.
There was red,
so there's
green.
The same.
No, there's actually fewer, David. There was red, green, blue, black, and gold. We had 5.
Well, you had too many.
Not including yellow, which was reception.
Oh, okay. So there are less, but I feel like that might be an improvement. That's a lot of phases. There's less, but the changes are a lot more drastic, I guess. Like once you go
those
from
phases also spanned your whole training because we were OSA.
Yeah,
so it spanned all the way from the beginning of a basics to the end of AIT.
I guess it might be different for OSA because I didn't do OSA. I went someplace else for my.
Just for reference, OSA is one station unit training.
Yeah, so you do your basic and your AIT at the same place, basically, and
same unit.
What I'm curious about is from a veteran's point of view. Now, actually, before I ask this, I'm curious also. Now, once you got out of basic training during that Gulf War, did you go to where were you stationed? At least what you were willing to say in the general area. I don't want you to.
When I got out, the only conflict that was going on was the Bosnia Serbia thing.
Hmm.
The only thing going on in the Gulf War was Operation Desert Fox, which was a Clinton era debacle. It was just airstrikes. But when I got out, when I got out of basic and AIT, I went to Fort Lewis with the 14th Engineers 555 Engineer Group, Alpha Company.
So and Fort Lewis, where is where?
In Washington, just south of Seattle.
Okay. And I'm sorry, you were saying you got out there and you with the engineer.
That was honestly one of the best units and greatest units I was in my whole career. They had a unique mission, and we did a lot of fun stuff.
Interesting. What if you don't go to a place where there's anything going on? What I'm curious about, again, a non-military guy, what I'm curious about is how did your basic training? You said it made you a better soldier. How were you soldiering as an engineer? And I'm not questioning it. What I'm getting at is I'm really curious about, obviously basic training really shaped you, and it sounded like you really came in a lot of ways pre-shaped, but it shaped you and refined you. And so in those ways, when you're not going just, I'm going to out of basic training into combat. How is basic training affecting what you're doing when you're in Fort Lewis? How does it?
Basic training prepares. It gives you the literal basics. It teaches you the bare minimum you need to be a soldier. Your AIT teaches you the bare minimum you need to do your job as in your prospective field. At Fort Lewis, the first thing when I went to that unit, the first thing my NCO, Sergeant Hansen, told me was, forget everything that you learned, because we're going to teach it to you again.
Interesting. And was that a good thing?
Oh yeah, because in basic training, it's TRADOC, so it means that they're by the books. They teach you what's in the books. When you get to your unit, if it's a good unit, they take their new soldiers and they teach you everything in a real world perspective.
Yeah, when you're going through training, they only teach you what's in the books, like introduction to what you're going to be doing as in that situation that they present to you in that drill. Your unit, if they're good, will teach you things that they've learned from like the seniors there, the people who have a combat patch or two. Those are the guys who have real combat experience. Those are the guys that you're going to be learning from, and those are the guys you should be listening to. Take what the books say with a grain of salt, basically, because they can only teach you so much compared to what people with real experience can teach you.
Everything in the books changes when the lead hits steel.
What movie of any really was similar to the experience of the Army that had some sort of real similitude, if you will, of how it was in the Army? And you had mentioned Full Metal Jacket, and particularly you had pointed towards the basic training scene. So what I'm curious about is what was it about that? Was there anything specific? I mean, I don't know. If it's just general, that's fine. If it's just that general idea of yes, it was very similar. But if I was curious about why Full Metal Jacket and what is about that really you felt was captured well on film.
It wasn't very similar to what I went through because by the time I came in, they'd gotten rid of a lot of the old school stuff. But the attitude was there, and you see the soldiers go from a bunch of separate people to being a conglomeration of people, a team, so to say.
Yeah.
And you also have a realistic drill sergeant there, so.
Oh yeah, well, he was actually a drill
Honestly,
sergeant, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know he was actually in the military. I just wasn't sure about the drill sergeant part.
Yeah, he actually served as a drill sergeant for a time.
Blanking on his name
Right.
right now.
That one, as far as basic training goes, that's the only realistic portrayal that I've ever seen come out of Hollywood.
Guys, R.
But-
Lee Emery. Ermy, my bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
R.
Army,
Lee
Army.
Ermy. That was his name.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I'm curious about too is have you seen Band of Brothers? And I know it's a different
Yes, I
era. That was World War II. I know it's a different style of outfit. You know, this being an airborne type of thing but that is Army. So I'm curious about. Do you see any of the connections? Do you feel that was in any way? Something that was truthful in its telling. Again, in a different era, so you have to sort of account for that. But do you feel that was
Yeah.
that?
I wouldn't be able to say because that movie, the training that they go through in that movie, is like you said from a different era. That and they from start to beginning, it was the same people together. In basic training in the military nowadays, you start off with your training unit, and then once you graduate, you all split off the different units throughout the military, throughout whatever branch of military you're in. So I was lucky enough to end up with a couple of the people from my basic training unit at the same post, my first posting. So I had a few people that I already knew. But other than that, I probably only ran into a handful of them throughout my career.
Now, how is it split after? Like, are you split based on the job types, or how is it split after that basic training, or at least that part of basic training?
Wherever the Army needs more bodies for certain units.
Yeah, so based on your MOS, which is basically your job that you perform for the Army, will determine where you go based on how many slots they have opened for that specific job.
Yes.
So
Simplistic way of saying it, but yes.
So it's not surprising that he would have at least ran into a couple of other engineers that he did go to training with.
See,
Go ahead.
Yeah. When you graduate basic and AIT, you get your orders sending you to a certain post where they need that many of your MOS. And then from there, the personnel command of that post decides what unit you go to based on the needs of the units that are posted there. So, like, me and two of the other people that I went to basic training with ended up going to the same company. And then once you get to the company, you go to whatever platoon and whatnot that they need.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you this: the MOS, it is what put you in that? Is that something that you how do you get your MOS? I mean, how are you assigned to that MOS?
With the Army, you when you're initially going through the recruiting process, you sit down with your recruiter, and they, at least back when I was in, they show you a bunch of honestly completely BS videos about your MOS, about all the different MOSs, and answer all your questions, and they make suggestions and whatnot based more or less based on what they need for bodies. But if you have anybody that if you have any knowledge of it beforehand, you can try to get into a different MOS that you want.
Yeah,
but
they'll make you suggestions, a lot of suggestions. Yeah. But
they'll try to convince you to go where they want you to go.
If you tell them you're not going to join if you don't get a certain job, they'll do everything they can to get that job for you, because at the end of the day, they still need you.
And what it comes down to is that recruiters actually have no say over what MOS you go to. At least back when I went in.
There's certain slots. They can tell you that a slot isn't open, and they'll try to get you whatever you ask for. But if they'll make a lot of suggestions based on what they think the army needs and what they're told to try to fill in. But they will try to get you whatever job you really want. And if you tell them you're not going to join if you don't get a certain job, they'll do their best to try and make sure you'll get that job.
Yeah. Nowadays, back when I went in, the recruiters would get you set on with an idea in your head, but nothing was set in stone. You weren't guaranteed a slot or anything until after you went through MEPS, and then you sat down with the career recruiter at MEPS, and then they'd tell you, okay, these are the slots we have open, and if you say, well, I really want this job, they'll look at the further projected slots and see if there's anything that they can get you into. Like, luckily, when I went in, I was a young, dumb kid. I wanted something that sounded exciting and, fun. I had two different ideas in my head. My recruiter convinced me to go a completely different track. It sounded fun. That's honestly the three things that I wanted when I joined. I wanted to get away from home, and I wanted to do something fun. And I didn't want to be stuck behind a desk. So when I went to MEPS, when I went to MEPS, when I sat down with the recruiters, because I was delayed entry, I was coming in before I was 18, I had plenty of time to play with to look for the job I wanted.
So what were the two that you referred to earlier? What were those two jobs that sound the most fun?
Well, originally, because of my family and my interests when I was in school and stuff, I was looking at being an MP or being counterintelligence. And somehow my recruiter talked me out of those and showed me a bunch of videos of people blowing stuff up and convinced me to be an engineer. Honestly, not the worst job in the world, and it was fun.
So they diverted you with that, and from what you remember, did they push you towards engineer, or at least try to convince you towards engineer because slots were open for that, or did you feel that it was?
They were pushing me towards combat arms.
Oh,
so something, in the combat MOS area, and I knew for a fact I didn't want to do infantry. Because I had certain family members that would have probably beat me about the head if I'd done that.
Oh. There's two people that go into infantry. People who don't have anything better to do, or people who want to kill people.
Interesting.
Actually, there's a third. Poor people.
There's a lot of type of people that go into the infantry, David. Actually, some some of the smarter people that I know went infantry.
Oh, absolutely.
But-
I know a infantry
It-
former infantryman that's
it's-
a engineer now. A was it a mechanical engineer?
Yeah. I mean, it's a job for people that are looking for an outlet or adventure.
Yeah, the mechanical engineer I just told you about. He joined to kill people.
Different era. I joined during peacetime, so there wasn't anybody to kill back then.
Mm.
So you became an
Yeah.
engineer, and then
Yeah.
when you became an engineer, that's when you went to Fort Lewis.
Yes. After I signed up for to be an engineer, did my time in the delayed entry program until my slot was until the time my slot was available, and then I went to Fort Lewis to do my basic in AIT. Yeah.
And then at that point, you're an engineer. So, can you give us at a high level or whatever level you want what an engineer does aside from the idea of blowing things up?
Demolitions
can
is
be
a big
included.
part of it, but combat engineers are primarily tasked with mobility and counter mobility operations, landmine warfare, counter landmine warfare. We also do support operations for artillery and armor, mostly earth moving. But that's only when they don't have anybody else they can call.
That means they put a replacement
And-
bridge on top of where a destroyed bridge is.
Oh, we do. That's part of the mobility operations. Yeah. Honestly, we don't do too much bridge work. There's actually a separate MOS for that called Bridgehead Crew Member. They do the bigger bridges. Honestly, our education on bridges when I went through basic and AIT was on the Bailey Bridge, which is made to span intermediate gaps, and the AVLB, which is meant to span short gaps really quickly. But we also do, depending on what units you get into, we do counter IED work, which is part of the mobility, and we also do some guerrilla warfare training,
Interesting.
which is part of the counter mobility training, which is part of the counter mobility tasking, I should say. But basic training in AIT, you get just cursory training on explosives and landmines and bridges and tactical stuff. Most of what you learn as an engineer, you don't really learn until you get to your first unit.
Huh.
And that really sets the pace for the rest of your career as an engineer, what your proclivities are in the engineer corps.
Interesting. So it's really on the job training at that point, and if you fall into an area that matches what you like, it can be a great thing. But if not, then can you move around within the engineering? Once you're in a slot, are you in a slot?
No. Every couple of years, you're going to go to back then it was every 2 to 3 years, you'd go to a different you'd go to a different unit. Like after I was done after I left Fort Lewis, I went to Korea for my first time, and I went from a light wheeled amphibious unit at Fort Lewis to a mechanized unit in Korea, driving an AVLB, an armored vehicle launched bridge, pretty much a big ass tank with a bridge on top. I honestly hated being mechanized. I loved being a light soldier, boots on the ground, out doing the missions. You only use the vehicles to get you close, and then everything else is on foot.
what you're describing here is something I think a lot of non-military people have no clue about, which is that, especially since the name engineer sounds like more a desk job. In the civilian world, it would be a desk job for the most part. So what you're describing is really fascinating to hear, because it's so much more active than you would ever expect from the name of it. But you went to Korea. I'm sorry, again.
Yeah, the Engineer Corps is massive. It's one of the larger corps in the U.S. Army. And within it, you have the combat engineers, which are pretty much infantry with PhDs. And then you have your construction guys, vertical, horizontal, electricians. You have all your different tradesmen for construction, everything. And then you also have the Civilian Corps of Engineers, which fall under us, which do if you go down to Louisiana, you'll see dams and levees and dikes that were built by the Corps of Engineers. That's not the Army per se. That's the civilian branch of the Corps of Engineers. So it's a huge, massive mechanism. And my battalion at Fort Lewis was a combat engineer battalion. The other battalion in the 555 engineer group when I was there was a construction engineer battalion. So our sister battalion was a completely different animal than we were.
Interesting. So you said you went to Korea, and at that point, again, you're in Korea during a time. How much impact being in Korea, and I assume that you're probably around Seoul. If not,
I was north of Seoul. The first time I was there, I was in a city called Pyeongtaejeon, and it's north of Seoul. It's actually not too far from the DMZ.
Really?
Yeah. So the easiest way to find it, Google Camp Casey, U.S. Army Garrison Casey, and that's literally in the middle of Pyeongtaejeon.
Interesting. So, does that indicate that part of what you're there for, being so close to the DMZ, did that have to do with North Korea?
Yes.
Okay.
Our whole mission there was, if North Korea invaded, was to be a speed bump to do counter mobility operations and slow them down if they got into our sector.
Yeah, it's a big if.
Yeah, which would honestly be an act of God for them, but still.
I mean, with the support of China, probably, but we'd noticed that before it even happened.
I mean, the likelihood of many of us surviving if they made it to our area was pretty slim. I mean, I was in the only unit that had to burn its colors, which that refers to burning your unit flag during the Korean War, because the whole unit was overrun and the few survivors were captured. So not exactly the best lineage to make you feel good about that.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
back then we also didn't have JDAMs, so
We were also within artillery range of North Korea too, so. But honestly, none of us really cared.
You didn't care about being in artillery range, or at that point were you just so young and gung ho? And I mean that as a civilian gung ho, if that has some kind of real military meaning, by the way. But being so young and enthusiastic or gung ho that you were just willing to do whatever, or
Neither. From the moment I joined the combat engineers, it was told to us multiple times that our life expectancy during an initial surge, during an initial attack, whether it was them attacking us or us attacking them, was 8 seconds.
Wow.
You get comfortable with the idea of mortality. You get comfortable with the idea that if shit hits the fan, you could die.
Yeah.
You most likely are going to die.
How true it is questionable. Don't really know, but it really does make you comfortable with the idea that you could die, and it encourages you to become harder to kill.
The statistics they gave us were actually historical statistics, but they were based off from the Normandy landings during D-Day.
Right.
So, I mean, I think everybody there had a short life expectancy.
Yeah.
But you become with mortality. You become comfortable with your mortality. You make your peace with your maker, and I mean, back when I joined, your chaplain was always there. Before you rolled out of the motor pool on any mission, they'd say a prayer for you. Before you had any function, they'd say a prayer. I mean, in basic training and AIT, whenever we had a large training exercise or something, the chaplain would show up, and it was encouraged. They actually encouraged us to go to services for whatever faith we had on Sunday. And literally, even if the people that didn't go were given unpleasant work of scouring the barracks and polishing every little piece of brass and stuff like that to encourage them to go to services. So back when I went in, the Army ran on faith a lot more than it does now.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. That's fascinating that they encourage it to that extent, that they really made you do all that kind of scut work that if you weren't going to go. That's very, very fascinating. And that was for training, and that was just for the training exercise. I mean, obviously for the real life exercise. I mean, any of the real life missions you had, but that was even for training. Now, now, one question I have is, were the trainings, and I understand that the trainings have to have large risk in order to train you for real life situations, but what do you feel that the fact that even for training they encourage you to see your chaplains, was that part of not just getting you right for the training, that the risk that it came with that, but for that when you're out there, that it's important for faith to be part of your life in the real life situations? Like, does that training for your is the chaplain part of the training as well?
More or less. I mean, back when I joined the Army had this thing. It was fairly new, not new, but it had been around for a few years, called leadership. And it was meant to... It wasn't even spelled leadership, really, but loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. It was meant to help instill moral values and the Army values into you. And part of that was, the services that they gave weren't, brimstone and fire services. They weren't the cheerful services. They were services with a meaning, services with a story. And I mean, the chaplains were soldiers too, so they were always there. and they were always helping us keep our moral compasses aligned.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've only, at least in my experience, I've only ever met a Christian chapel. I have yet to see any one else. So usually when they do a service, it's usually Christian. They try to accommodate for everyone else, obviously, but the message
We
is
have
usually
chaplains
Christian.
in the Army for most of the major faiths,
Yeah, but in my experience,
but the predominant one would be Christian, yes.
because most
Now, when you
most
say
most people become a chaplain because they're Christian.
Mm-hmm.
now when you say Christian, do you mean the idea of as opposed to Jewish or Muslim or whatever, or do you mean like is there a Protestant Catholic split there, or does it tend to be more Catholic or more
So
Protestant?
just as an encompassing idea of Christianity, like Protestants,
Yeah.
even evangelical or whatever, Orthodox, Catholics, as a group, the ones that worship Jesus.
We do have Catholics that work predominantly for certain denominations of Christianity, along with other faiths. But all the chaplains are trained to be able to service all the denominations of their faith and to supposedly help soldiers of other faiths also.
And what's interesting is I don't know what gear they get issued, but they do get issued gear. Like, for example, they do get like a ammunition bag. It's just a big bag that holds a ton of magazines. I thought that was interesting.
They go wherever we go, but they don't carry a weapon.
Yeah.
That's what the
Now,
chaplain site is for.
But is there a reason they don't carry a weapon?
Well, the whole idea of
They
the
are
chaplain, they're told a lot of them wouldn't join if they were told they have to be able to kill. At least that's my personal
Really?
belief. That's my personal belief. Because a lot of a lot of Christians don't want to kill.
the chaplains are there to look after our souls. The medics are there to look after our bodies, and we're there to handle everything else.
Mm.
So
Do the medics carry?
Yes.
Do they have weapons?
Yes.
yes, depending on what unit they are, they could be issued an M4 or an M9 or both.
Yeah. It also depends on the was it the adversary, I guess.
But yeah, medics can't fire unless fired upon. They can only fight in defense of themselves and their patients.
Yeah. So following the rules of the Geneva Conventions,
Yes.
which I don't know if will actually be adhered to in our next war. I can't speak
they
for the
were-
future, but I can speak for
I can tell you there were
past.
times when certain parts of the conventions were, I wouldn't say ignored, but severely bent
I don't think we've ever.
in the past.
I don't think we've actually ever been in a war where with a country that's actually followed had to follow Geneva Conventions. Like we've been fighting terrorists and insurgents
Not since
for the
World War
past
II.
20 years,
Mm.
if not longer.
Last time we fought a country that was a signatory of the Geneva Conventions was World War II.
Yeah, and see how that went.
Yeah.
There's a lot more
At least
accountability
World
in the
War
military.
II in Europe.
Yeah, there's a lot more accountability for soldiers now. I don't know how effective that'll be in our next
But I mean,
war, but
I've seen times where you're in a vehicle, the shit hits the fan, the gunner goes down, and the only other person in the vehicle with you, besides the driver and your TC, is the medic. And he jumps up on the gun and does what he has to.
yeah, you gotta do what you can to preserve yourself and your unit.
Yeah.
So
Well, makes sense.
I'd put medics in the group of passive aggressive.
I like that. Now, the accountability that you were talking about earlier, David, is that well, is it accountability? Because I know that when you're not facing an enemy who's at least saying they're going to follow the Geneva Convention, then you're having to, all the insurgency, all those type of situations, and even I'm assuming that China, if we're in a war with them, they're not going to really give a crap about Geneva Convention, even
I
if
mean,
they
I hope they would, because
signed
if
it.
they ignore it, then we can ignore it, and we have more weapons.
But we won't.
But we won't
Because what
we
separates
have
us from them is the fact that we fight fair.
yeah. But
We follow the rules
ideally,
most of the time.
in an ideal world, they don't. But I don't think I can't speak for them really. I personally don't think that they will to a T. I know that we'll try our best because we have a lot of accountability for soldiers and their actions these days, especially after the events of World War II. Even against insurgents, you're not supposed to do certain things. Obviously, that's why. And this is another topic, but that's why the government went around it and hired a lot of mercenary groups throughout our wars in the Middle East, because they have different rules of engagement. They have different doctrine that they follow, so they can get away with certain things.
They're also expendable.
Yeah, expendable, except 1,000 times more expensive.
Actually, if you look at the cost of training a soldier and upkeep of his equipment and everything else, they're cheaper.
Not really. When you're accounting for all the equipment they have, they usually get higher grade
Their
stuff.
equipment's theirs, not ours.
And we're paying for their equipment because they're using the money we pay them to buy their stuff.
Yeah, but
Mercenaries are 100% more expensive, but the government pays them so they can get around things, so they can accomplish missions without compromising soldiers.
Well, I know in the corporate world, we use contractors, and there's oftentimes they will hire, like the company I work for hires a lot of contractors, and those contractors, salary-wise, are paid much more than, well, at least the company they work for is paid much more for each one. But ultimately, it is thought to be less expensive altogether because of all the other costs that are avoided in doing so. And is that what you're saying? Is that kind of along the lines of what you're saying? Is that kind of thing
That's
where
part of it. It's also a lot cheaper to replace a mercenary than it is to replace a trained soldier.
Yeah, because they're already there. Their company pays for their training and whatever they get, their equipment. But their equipment and all the money that's used to train them still comes from the government. And whoever else pays them for their services.
Do you, for your own personal opinions, either one or both of you, do you think that this kind of contractor war is a good thing, or do you think it is ultimately a negative thing?
Well, I think
It depends on the scenario.
I think it's a negative thing overall because more people are dying, but
It depends on the scenario. If it was a force-on-force war, like, one country against another, I wouldn't want them there. Because they're a liability. If it's something like we had in the Middle East, that was the only way to do business. Because the insurgents, the terrorists, they didn't follow the rules.
insurgents don't have rules.
They didn't care. They did whatever they could. Women, children, innocent bystanders, they didn't care. Because in their belief, if a devout Muslim dies, he's going to heaven to meet Allah. No big deal for them. If somebody that isn't a devout Muslim dies, they're getting what they deserve.
Yeah,
So it's a win-win situation at that point for them.
Yeah, you're facing a hard enemy when they don't fear death.
Yeah. So we needed the civilian contractors to go in and do the dirty work that us as soldiers couldn't and wouldn't do.
Yeah, but now at the end of the day, it depends on how you look at it. Because on one hand, having those extra hands to help could prevent more deaths and casualties overall. But on the other hand, they could die and add to the casualties. So
Now,
it's
have I ever really liked working with civilians? No. Not in the least.
I don't
Why?
go as far as to call them civilians. I mean, a lot of them are ex-military. They just don't have anywhere else to go, so they join a contractor.
I was using that in a generic term, David.
So what is about civilians that make it difficult?
They do what they want to do. The contractors, they literally they go in, they do what they want to do, and there's no accountability. There's very little accountability, if any, with them. So they go in, they do their mission, but they screw everything up that we've been working for the last 6 months to do. Because we're not only there to fight the enemy, we're also there to get the civilian to help the civilian population and to get them on our side. Because that's the only way to win an asymmetrical war. But when they go in and they do their job, and with very little oversight or accountability, and they piss off the civilian population, it's the soldiers that bear the brunt of it.
So they just make a mess of it from your perspective, because they're going.
Yeah.
But do you feel that what they're doing, do they do it well, or do they tend to be? Is it tend to be? They do it poorly. It's just that they've been hired to do it.
Well, they
Is
wouldn't
it
keep hiring them if they didn't do the job.
They do their job well, but sometimes a little too well.
Yeah. Well, the reason I even asked that is because I don't know if I would agree. And now, not from a military perspective, but I know that, well, again, in the corporate world, and you can tell me how this jives with the military world, is that we hire contractors because we just need people in there. And there are some kinds of parallels here in that. Well, I work in an IT area, and so we hire a lot of contractors. It's very, in a sense, it's delicate work. It's specialized work. It's skilled work. But we'll hire people sometimes, and it doesn't truly matter how well it's about 50-50 whether the contractor group works well, like whether they can truly do a job. It's not that they can't do their job. It's just they don't do the job that we need them to do many times. They individually are smart. They know how to code. But my company has a specific way of doing things, and too many times we've gotten crap out of it. And so when we tell our executives that, no, just don't hire people just to hire people, hire the right people, that becomes a problem. But they keep hiring just whomever. They hire the same ones, but part of it's because they have contracts. Part of it because, some executive is like, hey, I like these people, I want to hire them. So, is that happen in the military where, to me, it's something that these kind of corporations work in ways where David, you and I were talking about the bureaucracy and the inefficiencies that go with it. It ends up being corporations end up being a bureaucracy. And so how much is military bureaucracy just going to keep doing the same thing? even though it doesn't necessarily make sense from the individual perspective.
They'll probably keep doing it. It all depends on the contractors themselves, because a lot of the contractors are honestly good people. A lot of them are former special operations and have a lot of training. But there's also some that are not from that area. So if you get a bunch of veterans come in that are contractors, they do a better job. But if you get a bunch of the ones that are pretty much never served and just worked as a contractor, they're the ones that tend to screw everything up.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense because you have that previous experience with at least with the military, you would have some more context. Whereas if you're just coming out of nowhere and then, you don't have that context, I guess. Yeah.
But yeah, back when I first joined the military, there were mercenary groups, but you'd never hear about them, or besides in like really crappy movies.
Or Soldier of Fortune magazine.
Yeah. And they were off fighting their own little private wars somewhere, and it never really bothered us. It wasn't until Iraq and Afghanistan that they ever really became a military asset, so to say. Although, I can understand the need for the use. One, we were massively undermanned. We still are. And it's not even the recruiting issues. The U.S. Army is designed to be able to fight 3.5 wars. Currently, with the size of the U.S. Army that it's at now, between downsizing when there's liberals in charge of the government and our recruiting issues, we can barely fight one war.
Yeah, I think as long as the Army keeps pushing towards becoming more and more bureaucratic, we're always going to have the issue of recruiting, because a lot of people don't want to join just to do paperwork, and that seems to be what's happening. Like, people have this idea of the Army or the military in general, and they see all these new ads about like the Army, like that newer one that came out, like, what was it, a couple years ago now, with the lesbians, and it has nothing to do with the military. The whole idea of the military is to strip away like your individuality and make you equal to everyone else around you, but it kind of defeats the purpose with an ad like that, and that really did impact the recruitment. But
wokeness is definitely not helping.
Yeah, and
neither
it's
is
becoming more public.
Of...
So people who would have otherwise joined are being exposed to this in the media, and they're seeing what it's becoming, and they're like, you know what? No, thank you. I think I'll just buy an AR or something, and I'll read online, or I'll just join a local militia group or something like that. Which in of itself there's nothing wrong with that, but instead of doing what they wanted to and defending the country, which still joining a militia group could do that, but they're throwing away an opportunity, and the government's helping them throw away that opportunity because they're just not making it an organization that people want to join. And the problem is out of touch officers at the top brass. They're so out of touch with reality, and they're trying to push all this woke garbage onto the military and onto people. It's just making no one want to join. It's pushing people away.
Three things that hurt the Army the most, in my opinion, is this new wokeness that they've been trying to push in. That's hurting us, honestly. Because if you're that touchy-feely about things, the military probably isn't where you should be. It's the new kindler, gentler army. The lowered standards.
The Army isn't concerned about the things they should be concerned about.
No.
Or
It's
the
also the
just the military.
civilianization of the military. And I'm not talking about mercenaries. Back when I joined, you hardly ever saw a civilian that wasn't a dependent on post. You went into an office, there were soldiers there that were running that office. You went into the Central Issuing Facility, CIF, and there were soldiers, logistical soldiers, issuing out the gear. Now, you go into an office in the military, you might see one soldier, and everybody else in there is a civilian. And they're getting paid 10 times what that soldier's getting paid to do the same job that you had a private doing back when I joined.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. You have civilian office workers, you have civilian resource workers, you have civilian DFAC workers, and a DFAC is basically a military cafeteria. And even in the DFACs, there used to be soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're striking because they're not getting paid enough, and the Army and the military can't pay soldiers either, and this, that, and the other thing.
Well, if they took the money that they were paying those civilians and put it towards pay raises for military personnel and tried to get our pay up to a respectable level,
I think a better word is acceptable, because that's another big thing that I didn't even mention. Is
it would help their recruitment a lot.
Is pay. If people look up, if you look up Army pay 2023 or Air Force, anything, military pay 2023, it's going to be the same exact thing it was years ago. It may be a little bump here and there, but nothing significant. People look at that and they're like, even with free room and board, I'm expected to live off of this.
Yeah. It's, I mean,
that turns away people. Soldier. That turns away people just looking for a paycheck.
If you're a single soldier, you're expected to live in the barracks and eat in the DFAC. So you're pretty much living in a dorm that you're subject to inspections all the time. So you're living the military life. And you're eating in a DFAC, which honestly, Army chow, not the best in the world.
It depends which base you get put on.
The only place I've ever had decent food on an Army-run base was when I was in Iraq.
Yeah, so pay is a huge issue because they charge you to eat at the DFAC, which why? Because you already joined. You expect you get free food. They still tax you, which again, why? You're already making government money, so what's the point of taxing you again? You're making taxpayer dollars. Why tax dollars? It makes no sense. And with what little you have left, most people spend it on alcohol or just a car, and they're already making car payments. So what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? Are you expected to save? No. So let's say you go in for 4 years, you make specialist, you retire off your 4 years, maybe you saved everything you have, you don't have a car. Even with that, what little money you have left, you probably could have saved in a year with a regular job.
Yeah.
Because
there's also other expenses, like you do get a uniform allowance, which is
spent on alcohol.
has hardly ever gone up. I mean, literally, I was getting almost the same uniform allowance. I think it went up like $10
Yeah, I don't
between the time I
know.
went in and the time I got out.
I don't know what it looks like now.
was like-
The last time I was on a base, I paid like $40 for a pair of pants.
Yeah. Back when I joined, the uniform allowance was enough to buy one uniform. And you only get this yearly. It was enough to buy one uniform. Now, the uniform allowance isn't even enough to buy a whole uniform. And you usually go through a couple sets of uniforms a year, easy. Unless you're in a pencil push, unless you're in a rear echelon pencil pushing job. If you're a combat arms or combat support soldier, which is 90% of the army, you're guaranteed to mess up at least 2 or 3 uniforms a year, to the point where they're no longer serviceable.
Yeah, and I don't even get a uniform allowance as a reservist.
Well, that's the nice thing about the reserves. The reserves actually have a better issue system for the uniforms. You can turn in your uniforms when they get messed up and get new ones.
Yeah, that's what I
active
was going to
duty.
say. I don't get one. I can just turn in my non-serviceable uniforms and get new ones, which is nice, and I don't know why that's not a thing in active duty.
Active duty, we have to buy them ourselves.
That doesn't
The
make
only
sense.
ones you get for free is your initial issue. And every time they change the uniforms, you don't get a new issue of uniforms. You have to go out and buy the new uniforms yourself.
How often
Like
do
when
they
they
change the
changed-
uniforms?
And they have changed them 3 times since I joined. Just the basic combat uniform. We went from the BDUs, the traditional camo, woodland camo that everybody knows, to the ACUs that we had, that some officer and some office thought looked good because they wanted to copy the Marcom, the Marines camouflage pattern, but the Marines said they couldn't have it. So they came up with their own digital camo that did not blend in with anything.
I never got that.
Worst camouflage pattern ever designed. And it was literally, the program was run by a bunch of officers that had no combat experience.
Yeah, it never made sense why the Marines didn't just let us have it. We're on the same exact side. What's the deal?
It's a rivalry thing between us and them.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
It's the same reason why the XM5 program got canceled. When they were the first time they tried to replace the M4. We developed the XM5, the Army was all set to buy it. Luckily they didn't.
It was also a piece of poop. So
It was an okay weapon for the time. And a lot of the technology went towards creating the new weapons that we have now. But the whole reason the Army didn't buy it is because the Marine Corps complained that they weren't in on the process, in on the development process, and the DoD told the Army to scrap it.
yeah, which I don't get, because if the military was a person, like a body, the Marines would be the shoelaces. Because they're literally they're part of the Navy, they're just a smaller part. I don't understand why people think of them as this huge organization. They're part of the Navy.
They're a very good and very necessary organization, though.
Right, sure. That's as true as that is. Still, I don't think that they
I
should
have a lot of
as-
friends that are bullet sponges.
Yes, but I feel like they get more of a bigger soapbox than they should.
Are you saying that the Navy are the shoes of that same?
All right, let's not get too
image?
deep into it. All right, we've already established that the Marines are the shoelaces. Right? Maybe even
No.
the soles of the boots.
So
I
here's
don't know,
here's what
we had different names for them back then. We used to
Well-
refer to the Marines as bullet sponges or walking sandbags.
You said that, Wayne, that now there's wokeness. Wokeness is everywhere. When you joined up, wokeness was not even a thing. It was not even a word that meant anything other than that your eyes had already come open in the morning. So my question is this: is that back then, and I David and I had talked about this before. Back when I was growing up, and you and I have kind of crossed some of our timelines, is that the Democrats and Republicans were just they were on the opposite sides of the fence, but they were reasonable people either side. And for me, the Democrats were always reasonable people for the most part. Even the people who call themselves Democrats tend, by and large, are reasonable people. Nowadays, everything is woke, and woke by almost its very definition means that there's division. So my question is that back then, how much did politics even get discussed in any kind of personal level, and how much was it ever discussed from a top-down approach?
Never from a top-down approach. Never. Because that is actually against Army regulations.
Not anymore, apparently.
We don't discuss... We weren't allowed... our command wasn't allowed to discuss anything having to do with politics or elections with us, besides reminding us to send in our absentee ballots and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a thing. We don't talk about like elections or anything, but it's absolutely like in the military. Otherwise, a lot of these things wouldn't exist. It's just disguised as other things.
But talking between ourselves, always. Soldiers have always been politically aware.
Mm-hmm.
And mostly because, and we know when there's a Democratic president, we're going to be hitting rough times. When there's a Republican president, it's going to be the land of milk and honey when it comes to our budgets.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember when I joined, it was during the Clinton administration, and there were units that had such little funding, they were running around doing training yelling bang 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 because they couldn't afford the blanks for their guns.
Really?
We were having to make our own training aids a lot of the time because we just couldn't get them.
That's just regular stuff on the reserves.
Oh yeah. Luckily, my unit that I was in when I first joined wasn't as affected by the Clinton era cutbacks and stuff. So, because of our particular missions, so we didn't feel the budget crunch as much, but we still knew it was there because of everybody else around us. Now, I mean, I could say there's always been budget issues. The Army's never had enough money for what it really needs. Now, that's mostly because of the brass and because of politics, but yeah. Now, yeah, soldiers have always been very aware of politics.
Hey, you're talking about budgets. It sounds like it's hard for civilians to know, and maybe civilians who are reading up on all this stuff, maybe they understand it, but I think that, again, likening it to the corporate world, if we have a budget crunch, that means we don't hire more people. We have hiring freezes, and then, but essentially everything else, for the most part. Again, I work in IT area, so yeah, you may not be able to get all the technology you want, but nothing else changes, and we're able to do our job. But it sounds like, I mean, with the Army, there are more people coming in. Maybe not as much now, or maybe if there are recruitment problems, you're not having that just constant flow in. But that's what I think is in a sense startling, I guess, is that you have more people. the budget stays the same or the budget goes down, now you're doing things like you just described where units are running around saying bang, bang, instead of actually having the equipment they need to do training. That to me is mind blowing because you don't hear that as a civilian, that's how it affects. It affects the rank and file soldier the most.
Oh, yeah.
Because most of the time you think, oh well, some brass is not going to be able to, build a new, I don't know, some new bomber or build a warship, and everybody's like, oh, see, we don't need another bomber. We've got plenty of bombers. But it really affects that rank and file the most, and that's what was mind blowing.
Yeah, just take a basic trainee. Take actually a first-term soldier like David. By the time he gets out, by the time he's done with his first couple of years in the military, the Army will have spent over $1 million on him. That's medical care, training, feeding him when he's working, his equipment. That's just one soldier.
Yeah, and either way, they're going to build that next bomber. They just take money from other people, and other units.
Yeah,
they work from the bottom.
They take money from where they can cut to fund the programs that they think they need. So they'll take money from our training budgets. They'll take money from base improvement projects. Because trust me, base improvement projects are low tier in their mind. The soldiers can get along without having a gym that isn't infested with black mold. We'll just clean up the old one. Yeah. Who cares if the commissary and the PX look like something out of the 1940s, or their housing is 4 cinder block wall?
Yeah, when I went to AIT, the building was falling apart. From the outside, it looked sturdy, it looked normal, but you went inside, a bunch of missing tiles in the ceiling, a leak, maybe 3 on every floor at least.
Yeah. Here's one
washing machines down. What's up?
Here's one that we can both relate to. The house that we lived in El Paso. It was literally a reject from the 1950s. I mean, the walls were concrete, the floors were institutional linoleum tiles. I mean, yeah, this is how messed up Fort Bliss was. We had housing like that, but they spent millions of dollars building a brand new PX and entertainment complex on Post.
But you probably had to pay your money to take part in.
The movie theater was actually pretty cheap. The movie theater and the PX were the only things that were... the movie theater, the PX, and the food court were the only things that were run by the military through AAFES, Army Air Force Exchange Service. Everything else, it was space rented to civilian businesses. We barely had... Our house was rated to be for a family of 5. There was barely enough room for the 4 of us.
So let me ask you this: how can civilians know about this more? Because when civilians go to vote, and I understand that we're not voting on budgets, we're not voting on that, but how can information like this be more commonly aware among civilians? Because it certainly could impact who they vote for to put in to support these type of measures. Because I mean, again, it's mind blowing to me to hear this stuff.
Yeah. Find out more, do your research, talk to veterans, talk to people that are actively serving.
but I think what it's difficult is knowing who are the earmarks. And this is a larger question. Honestly, I that may even have been not necessarily an unfair question, but an unfair question to ask and to expect an immediate response for. Only because I think it's more difficult to figure it out. How do we know who are those people who are going to be supporting the military, the rank and file, the people who need it the most, not the military as an institution, but the soldiers who who we really want to support. And it's funny because from a civilian perspective, they always love to parade the soldiers around. The people who are your everyday soldier, they love to parade them around, but then you find out that they are taking advantage of them essentially, and all the things you said, from not even giving them having to make them pay for a uniform, giving them some kind of allowance, but never increasing it, never even making it sounds like commensurate with the amount the uniform would be, to charging for all these different things, and then like you said, David, taxing them on top of it. They're talking about double taxes. I mean, the taxes came in, and now they get paid to you, and you get taxed on that as well. So it goes back in the old politicians' coffers. But I think that's what's difficult is who are the types of people, and this might be for a future episode, because this might be something that maybe both of you could even think about, and maybe David and you and I could talk about. But how do we know who to vote for? Because I absolutely agree with Wayne with what you said, and that do your research and talk to veterans, but it's so difficult to even know what to talk. This came up in this conversation, but I wouldn't have known to ask what veteran, what your soldier, your average soldier goes through, what they have to deal with, and how the budget it gets shortchanged, in relation to them. So I think that's what I want to. Who can we put into power so that they can actually influence the brass, influence the other idiot politicians to pass the budgets, or to at least hold the brass accountable for the budget that's passed?
Well, you can start by voting for someone who can speak in complete sentences.
I would say if you're looking at currently serving congressmen or senators, look at the voting record. It's right there, public information on the internet, easy to find. Look at their voting record.
Yeah, and you should know
See
who
what they
you're
voted.
voting for too. Don't just take the media's word for it. Look up this person and make
Do
sure
your
you
research.
actually know
Look
who
into
you're
them.
voting for. I mean,
Vote
if it
for
were up to
somebody
me, we'd just do away with voting. We'd just have a really big fight with a bunch of strong people, and the last one standing would be president. But hey, whatever.
The WWE version of politics. I like that. Here's the thing: is that you've already pointed out, though, that they're going to get their bombers, they're going to get their warships, they're going to steal from Peter to pay Paul. So when you see a politician who would be voting for expanding the budget, the question still remains, though: is that budget going to affect the people it should the most, which is
No.
So, I think that's what the struggle is, and maybe there's no answer for it. To be honest, maybe
It's
there's no
not
answer
about-
for it because of the bureaucracy.
It's not about voting for who's going to increase the budget the most. That doesn't really matter when at the same time they're just going to reallocate the funds to make bigger paychecks for the top brass. It's you want whoever's going to take down the bureaucracy, whoever's going to reduce that, whoever's going to put people in charge who are in touch with reality, people who go outside and talk to their subordinates and know the soldier.
Yeah. That and transparency. We won't ever have a good answer to that until there's more transparency. I mean, there's a large portion of the military budget that, unless you're part of where that money's being allocated to, no, you won't know where the money's going. There's a lot of things that they won't tell the general population about budgets and stuff because it's quote unquote too sensitive or whatnot. I mean, I can understand the need for secrecy in some aspects, but until we have more information, it's very hard to make an informed decision.
True statement. Absolutely true statement. Well, I think, David, I think that this has, I think this is a good stopping place, and I think this is going to be a good springboard for some future episodes because this has really opened a lot of stuff that I think we can delve into, and so I think this is a great stopping place right now.
Yep, we're almost at 2 hours. So, yeah. Do you have any closing remarks?
I'm always here if you guys want to talk.
Any advice to give to our viewers, listeners, rather?
Even though I've said pointed out some of the downsides to the military, if I had it to do it again, I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
Hey, there's no
Join
better
the
recommendation than that.
Serve your country and be proud of it. There's a lot of things you can learn. It makes you a better person. And, I mean, my pay may not have been the best, but I walked out of the Army debt-free.
All right. I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you for listening.
William, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you will join us again in the future. We can have some more,
this won't be the last
more great
time.
discussion.
I'm always willing to talk.
All right. So I think that sums it up. Thank you for listening, and we will talk to you next time, or let you listen in next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.